According to the New York Times, current U.S. President Joe Biden has authorized the Ukrainian military to use long-range missiles for the first time to strike targets in the Russian Federation. These are ATACMS missiles. According to the sources cited by journalists, the weapons are likely to be used first against Russian and North Korean troops to protect Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region of the Russian Federation. The authorization for Ukraine to use long-range missiles was a response to Russia's unexpected decision to engage North Korean troops. Journalists note that this was clear by summer, as Russia and the DPRK agreed to exchange technology or military personnel. So what exactly was unexpected for the Americans is not entirely clear, even if we knew about it with much less intelligence resources. New York Times sources believe the authorization of strikes will not radically change the war's course. Biden's policy change aims to warn North Korea that its forces are vulnerable and should not send more troops to aid Russia. In fact, there is an interesting nuance that we will also talk about. According to American officials, although the Ukrainians are likely to use missiles against Russian and North Korean troops in the Kursk region first, Biden may allow them to use these weapons elsewhere in the Russian Federation. Some U.S. officials have expressed concern that Ukraine's use of long-range missiles into the Russian Federation could prompt Vladimir Putin to retaliate against the United States and its coalition partners, but other U.S. officials have said they believe these fears are exaggerated. In the end, the only one who has officially spoken out against this grant so far is Donald Trump's son, Eric, who called everyone who decided to allow Ukraine to use American long-range missiles on the territory of the Russian Federation idiots. The New York Times, meanwhile, writes that the Ukrainians could use ATACMS missiles to strike at concentrations of Russian and North Korean troops, key pieces of military equipment, logistics hubs, ammunition depots, and supply lines deep in the Russian Federation. This could help Ukrainians weaken the effectiveness of the Russian-North Korean offensive. Biden decided the benefits include Ukraine achieving key goals and sending a message to North Korea about the cost of its interference, with the risks of escalation outweighing the benefits. The article states that if Russia succeeds in attacking Ukrainian forces in Kursk, Kyiv may have little Russian territory left to offer Moscow in negotiations. Therefore, the journalists note that although both British and French leaders expressed support for Zelensky's long-range strikes on Russian territory, they were the first to express no desire to allow their missiles to strike. Against this backdrop, Reuters writes that Ukraine plans to strike at Russian territory with the help of primarily American long-range missiles in the coming days. They write about this with reference to three sources: that Ukraine plans to launch, quote, the first long-range strikes in the coming days. Our sources say this without disclosing details for reasons of operational security. Among other things, the White House has so far refused to comment on the authorization for the strikes, and so on. Reuters journalists also emphasize that some U.S. officials are skeptical about whether such a decision could change the overall trajectory of the war. However, this could greatly help the Ukrainians, especially in those hot spots where the Russians have made successful advances. Among other things, Le Figaro writes that France and Britain, following the United States, will allow Ukraine to use their long-range missiles, the French Scalp. And the British Storm Shadow for strikes on the territory of the Russian Federation. The publication states that the decision is already on the table and Ukrainians will learn about it soon, citing the U.S. permission to use ATACMS on Russian territory. Our President Volodymyr Zelensky, commenting on media reports that the United States, Britain, and France had authorized the use of long-range missiles against Russia, said that the missiles would speak for themselves. The president says the plan to strengthen Ukraine is a victory plan, with long-range capability being a key point. He notes there's media talk about receiving permission for action, but strikes aren't announced. Missiles will speak for themselves. Ukraine already has missiles, but for details on long-range strikes, he suggests further listening. Today, many in the media are saying that we have received permission to take appropriate actions, but strikes are not delivered with words. Such things are not announced. The missiles will speak for themselves, for sure. Glory to Ukraine and its heroes. We will closely watch how these missiles strike Russian territory, targeting areas from which Russia draws resources for its attacks and offensive operations, both in eastern Ukraine and the Kursk region, where a Russian-North Korean offensive is now concentrated.
І підживлювати свої наступальні операції як на сході нашої країни, так і в Курській області, де зараз зосереджується вже не просто російський наступ, а російсько-північно-корейський, як його тепер, до речі,
North Korean troops are a significant reinforcement for the Russian occupiers in this area. Kurt Volker, expert at the European Policy Analysis Center and former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine, said the U.S. authorization to use weapons against targets deep in Russia reverses a political decision that should never have been made. Kurt Volker explained that Ukraine is a victim of external aggression, and in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter, it has an inherent right to self-defense. He emphasized that while Russia attacks Ukraine from very long distances, the United States has prevented Ukraine from retaliating against the same activities. Volker says, Ukraine has the right to strike any military target, only has to avoid shelling civilians. That's the only requirement. There are no restrictions in international law on the range of use of weapons. By restricting the range of Ukraine's use of U.S. weapons, the United States has unjustifiably imposed unilateral restrictions on Ukraine's self-defense that go beyond any requirements of international law. This unnecessary restriction on Ukraine's self-defense should have been lifted. According to him, the decision on the range of weapons used was completely arbitrary and was made out of fear of provoking Russia, not for any moral or legal reasons. Putin knew he was attacking Ukraine and had to be prepared for military consequences. He is convinced that a change in bad U.S. policy is good news, but it should not be made public, as it gives Russia advance information about potential Ukrainian strikes.